Good evening, everybody. My name is Pádraig. I am the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust, and you're all very welcome this evening to the latest in our webinar series. If this is your first Irish Wildlife Trust webinar, you're very welcome. We're delighted you're here. If you're not familiar with our organization, the Irish Wildlife Trust is a non-governmental charitable body. We've been around since the late 1970s, and our goal in life is to raise awareness of the importance of nature for people and to campaign for better rules and regulations around our wonderful biodiversity. The last couple of years, since the pandemic started, we began this webinar series, and it's proved to be very popular. If you've missed any episodes, please do go on to our YouTube channel, where you'll find the vast majority of our webinars on all kinds of topics around nature and climate and biodiversity and water, with all kinds of expert speakers from around Ireland and beyond. So do check that out. And before we move on to the main events this evening, I would encourage you all, please, to visit our website. It's iwt.ie, and consider joining as an IWT member. You'll get a copy of our quarterly magazine, which is called Irish Wildlife, and you will get to participate in our events, and you support our activities and our campaigning work around nature in Ireland. So please do go on there and support us if you can. Now, just for this evening, we've got a very exciting speaker to talk to us all this evening about native woodlands. Just before I get on to pass over to Richard, a little bit of housekeeping. You will see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button, and there is also a chat button. So at the end of Richard's talk, we're going to leave some minutes for questions and discussion, but please put your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat, because that means I'll only be monitoring one set of comments, if that's okay. By all means, use the chat to chat amongst yourselves, but if you have questions for Richard, put them into the Q&A. As you probably noticed already, this event is being recorded, and we're going to put it onto our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you know anyone who missed it, you'll know where to direct them after the event. So on to the main event, and we're always interested to talk about our native woodlands, and there's huge interest, I think, in our native woodlands of late, particularly maybe as a response to our climate and biodiversity emergency. And we've done a number of webinars in the past about this topic. But tonight we have author and ecologist Richard Nairn. Richard is, I would say, a very prolific author, but of late he has written a series of books, one of which is this beautiful Wild Woods, about the magic of Ireland's native woodlands. It's part of a trilogy series, one of which is about the coastal and marine area. And there's another one forthcoming this summer about our rivers, which is called Wild Waters. So you're very welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we're very much looking forward to your talk. So please, in your own time, share your screen. And unmute yourself there, maybe, if you're talking.
Okay, got that?
There you are. Very good.
I'm back. Hello. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's amazing to see how many people are tuning in. I thought the days of Zoom talks were over, with things getting back to normal a bit, but it's certainly a very handy way of reaching out to people, and I hope that everybody finds something of interest this evening. So as Pádraig said, I'm going to talk about Ireland's native woodlands and try and bring you through some of the reasons why we need to give them priority. And I'll just explain initially why I got involved, which might help you to understand a bit about it. I live in a lovely rural area of East Wicklow in this valley here, and as you can see, it appears to be full of woodland, but if you look more closely, you'll see that almost all of the slopes and hills are covered in forestry plantations full of exotic conifers, and the lower part of the valley is filled with hedgerows, many of them very mature hedgerows, but very little actual woodland. It just happens that the farm where I live has a patch of, a very small patch of old, mature native woodland. And this was the thing that inspired me to write the book Wild Woods a few years ago. So I'll tell you a little bit about that first, and then I'll bring you into the wider picture in Ireland as a whole. So this happens to be a surviving area of woodland, which was here, part of which was here anyway, we know 200 years ago, because it appears on the first edition of the Ordnance Survey maps from 1830s. And that's confirmed by the size of some of the trees. There are alder trees here that are over 1.5 meters in diameter. And they hang over the bank of a river which flows along through the woodland. The ground is in fact very wet, and alder is one of the main dominant trees in the canopy. And there are also a number of large birch trees. This one here is one of the oldest, and you can see it has the typical kind of fluting on the bark, which is this ridged appearance with spreading roots above the ground, which are known as buttress roots. They're a bit like the buttresses on a cathedral to hold up really high walls. So it's a huge tree, and it kind of dominates the whole section of the woodland. But there are many different trees of different ages and different species. It's quite unlike a plantation in that their trees are kind of random, and many of them leaning like they are in this picture. And their species are all mixed. So the implication of that is that they've seeded themselves there. They weren't planted in any sort of regular way. But there are a number of other features, I think, which make this particularly interesting as a native woodland. The first one is there's quite a lot of fallen logs, as in the top left-hand corner. Some of these are broken off fragments, and you can see the rotting timber in the top right-hand side. That was a hollow tree, actually, that fell only last winter. Some of them, of course, have fallen over the river into streams and block some of the streams going with the debris backing up behind the logs. And that's particularly a noticeable feature in these wet woodlands. And then we have standing timber as well, which where you have broken off snags, such as the one in the bottom left there, that has left a standing piece of timber that has other kind of microhabitats that are dry, and that host a whole range of other species, both plant and animal. And if you look closely at the top of this one, you'll notice there's a woodpecker nest hole in it. So they benefit from these standing snags of rotting trees. But it's not just the dead trees that are important. The living trees are a key part of it as well. And we have something like 10 or 11 forest tree species, and you can see a few of them here. Some of these are more plentiful than others. The ash, for example, and ollie are pretty common. The others maybe less so. And they vary. Where you find them in the woodland depends on the soil. It depends on how wet it is, how steep the slope is, how thin or deep the soil is. And so it's quite a mix. Then in spring, just in the next few weeks, we're going to see an absolute mushrooming of wildflowers. Perhaps mushrooming is the worst wrong verb, but the ground will be covered with wood anemones and bluebells and many other species as well, lighting up the woodland floor before the leaves come on the trees and cast a dense shade over the ground. So they all flower, or most of them flower quite early, in order to make the best of the light that's coming in the spring. And we've got species like this, some of which grow on dry ground, and others like the marsh marigold and the bugle are in the damper ground. So it's really nice over the next few weeks to sort of follow the progress of those wildflowers as they appear and then disappear again. So from the start, we've taken, tried to get to know what's there. It's really important before starting any kind of management or intervention in any way in a natural habitat to understand what lives there, because you could march in and do all kinds of things and actually ruin the habitat for more sensitive species. So we've been fortunate to have visits by botanists and zoologists and various other naturalists. And so far we've recorded over 150 species of flowering plants, ferns, mosses, liverworts. One group I'd love to know more about is the lichens. We haven't had anybody look at those yet, but plenty of time for that. Fungi are also very rich, not just in the autumn, but that they're most of the year. Some of them more prominent in the summer, others tiny that you'd hardly see unless you really search around among the vegetation. Other big ones like the bracket fungus in the top left there. And it's largely on dead and decaying wood that you find these fungus species. That's not to overlook the fact that the soil itself has a huge network of fungal mycelia, mycorrhiza, which are in the soil and which are transmitting moisture and nutrients and communicating between the various plants in the woodland. And this kind of rotting wood is very important as well for certain insects such as beetles, isopods, and millipedes, and all sorts of insects that live in damp, dark conditions. And I'll come back to those in a few minutes. We did have a moth specialist come along with a moth trap and set it up for one night. And in a few hours, we had identified something like about 70 moth species. These are just a few of the more colorful ones, all released into the wild back again after they were trapped and identified. Birds are a little bit more difficult because they're singing in the early spring and early summer when the leaves are on the trees, and they're quite difficult to actually see much of the time, but you get to know their songs. And most people will know the garden birds, the robin, the wren. And with a series of visits over the spring and summer to the same area, following the same path through the woodland, it's possible to map out the territories. So we get clusters of song in the same areas, which we assume are the same male singing to defend its territory. It might move 10 meters one way or 20 meters the other way, but it will stay within its territory. And that gives us some idea of the number of birds there are, but it's a very rough estimate. So we estimate about 9 pairs of robins in this small patch of woodland. And then as the summer progresses, a number of other summer migrants visit us. The song of the blackcap is pretty prominent. Willow warbler in the edges of the woodland, and scrubby bits. Chiff-chaff singing from the taller trees. And then in the autumn and winter, woodcocks appear occasionally in the wood. We don't have them breeding, but they are migrants that arrive in the winter months. Mammals well represented too. but the most exciting thing was last summer we put up a continuous bat recorder on the edge of the woodland, and we didn't see these, but we had records of 7 different species of bats flying along the edge of the woodland and close to it. All but 2 of the bat species known from Ireland or resident in Ireland. So that was really encouraging. And one of the more recent additions is the bankfoal, which was originally an introduction into Ireland back in the 1940s, I think, spread from the southwest, from County Limerick, right across the country, and has now made it to Wicklow and seems to be fairly common here. So we're waiting for the appearance of barn owls now, who prey on bankfoals, and that's going to be an exciting finding when it does happen. I'm very confident we will see them at some stage. In one part of the woodland, on a steep slope, there's a really big pile of spoil like this. It looks like a bulldozer's been working, but in fact, it's a badger set, quite an old badger set. It has about 10 different entrances. And initially, I used to sit up in a tree waiting for the badgers to come out. Sometimes I was disappointed. Nothing happened. Other times I'd just see a nose poking out the hole. But in later years, I've set up a trail camera opposite to the set and at different entrances. I've had some amazing pictures, including daylight shots, such as this one of a female emerging from the set, and pictures of up to 4 cubs at a time outside, playing outside the set. We try to disturb the area as little as possible, so that they're left in peace. The woodland is also the place where some species are returning after an absence of many years, I guess. Woodpeckers were virtually unknown in Ireland when I started bird watching. They occurred as migrants most years, but they just single birds here and there. And then suddenly in 2006, I think the first record of a juvenile woodpecker was found in Ireland, and quickly followed by a number of other records. And I was amazed when I first heard drumming in the woodland on a spring morning. I couldn't believe when I heard it. I'd never heard it here. I heard it in England, all right. But it took me a couple of years before I found a nest site, and then once I had, it was amazing to watch the adults flying in to feed the chicks like clockwork. Every 2 minutes they'd be in with a meal for the chicks that would poke their heads out one after another out of the hole. We have buzzards and red kites in the area all the time, soaring over the land. And just the other day, we had a pair of buzzards that were circling above one another, which is a sure sign of courtship, and then dropped into the woods. So we're hopeful that they may choose it for a nest site. We haven't had them breed yet. I think it's only a matter of time, really. But one of the more exciting findings was that pine martens are regulars here. The first proof of this was a picture taken with the trail camera. In fact, I've had a picture of a pine marten going in and out of the badger set too. So they may investigate that perhaps for leftover scraps left by the badgers. They're out in daylight too, which is pretty amazing. So they've come back into right across the country. There's very good evidence that they prey on squirrels. So we hope that might put an end to some of the grey squirrels in this area. So just to recap a little bit about why native woodland is important and what is the difference between that and non-native, because it's not exactly a parallel with broadleaf woodland versus conifer, because of course we have some native trees which are conifers, and we have some non-native trees, which are broadleaves. So it's important to understand that the native woodland is that dominated by trees which have been here for thousands of years, as tree species which have been here thousands of years. Of course, most of them are much more recent than that, most of the individuals themselves, but that they arrived naturally here. They weren't planted or introduced in any way. A native woodland normally has a variety of different tree species, not just a single species, and is more varied in height. So you will get some gaps, some mature trees, some young trees replacing them. And of course, they have a much higher biodiversity value because most of the plants and animals that live there have evolved with those native trees over the thousands of years, and feed on them or roost in them or feed on their decaying material and so on. So that's the important difference from non-native woodland, which is much more recent. So some people ask then, what are the native Irish trees? And there are something around 36 species, give or take one or two, where there's maybe a little bit of debate about their native status. Some of those are in groups. For example, there are the 2 species of oaks, of 2 birches and 2 wild cherries. Up to 6 species of willow are native, and 4 different white beam species, which kind of surprised me when I read that. And as I said earlier, there are 3 conifer species. The Scots pine, now considered to be a native Irish species. Some of the Scots pines in Ireland considered to have been here, if you like, in the same place since the Ice Age. And a few very rare native species that you'll only see in a few parts of the country, like strawberry tree and black poplar and those type of things. So well worth getting to know which are the native species, because they're the ones to give preference to in any planting scheme that we might consider to extend our native woodlands. So you might ask, well, where have all the native woodlands gone? Because at one time, this is not Ireland, as you might imagine, but it's a kind of impression of what Ireland might have looked like before people arrived. And the first people, of course, came for about 8,000 plus years ago in the period known as Mesolithic, which really means the Middle Stone Age. And these people were hunter-gatherers. They didn't farm at all. Farming hadn't made it to this part of the world. And they lived from the land, not unlike some of the animals, I guess, collecting their food and trying to survive over the winter period when things were short. There would have been some clearings in the wood, of course, because there were a few grazing animals, not many. And we didn't have large herbivores in those days as we do today. But nevertheless, there would have been some. And it's thought that these 2 were, which are both woodland species, the wild boar and the brown bear, were both introduced by people around that time, because they're often associated with the archaeological excavations of Mesolithic age. So the bones of the pigs may have been introduced for hunting and then escaped into the woods and so on. And as we know, wild boars and wild pigs often feed on acorns. So the extensive oak woods of those times would have suited them perfectly. And the brown bear, it's thought, was introduced as well at this time. We don't really know why, but there's evidence from glacial period of brown bear living in caves, bones being found in caves. We don't know if they lived there or if they were chased in there and hunted, or how they got there, but there were brown bears in Ireland. And then about 6,000 years ago, farming did arrive eventually. And of course, that meant the beginnings of significant clearance of the forests. and cultivation of the ground and introduction of grazing animals. And among those were red deer, the first time that red deer came into the country. Again, the hunting continued, of course, even though farming was becoming the dominant way of life. And so red deer would have been a very valuable quarry for the Neolithic people, the New Stone Age people. And of course, they brought in their cattle as well, primitive breed of cattle. And the more sharp-eyed of you will notice the ear tags on this animal below, which suggests that it might be a modern animal, which of course it is. But it's from an old breed, so I just wanted to give the impression of what they might have looked like. I'm sure they were a lot shaggier than that one, actually. So coming right up then to more modern times, maybe 400 years ago, the woodland had shrunk to mainly river valleys, actually. There were a lot of patches remaining in river valleys on some of the mountainsides. Many of the mountains were bare at this stage. And if you look at some of the river valleys today, places like the Avonmore in County Wicklow, you'll notice there's still quite an extensive area of woodland cover in those valleys where they survive around the river, where there's steep land, not easily cultivated, and often secondary woodland, sometimes small fragments of original woodland. It was, in the 19th and 20th century that there was wholesale removal of a lot of the last fragments of original primary woodland. And this picture at the bottom right shows a huge oak log being harvested and taken away probably for export. And as the oak timbers were used extensively for building in Britain and abroad during that period. It's hard to conceive how they hoisted it onto the cart, actually, and how the horses would pull a log of that scale, but they must have done. So just in summary then, what we know is that around the Bronze Age period, which was after Neolithic, there was still something like 80% forest cover, or it's estimated that there was. We don't, of course, have accurate figures. And there was just a general decline then from then on, right through the ages, right down to the beginning of the 20th century, when woodland cover of all sorts was less than 1%. And you can see at the bottom right-hand corner, the graph almost touched the bottom. So that the last little peak there represents what's happened since the formation of the state in the last 100 years, when the cover of forest has reached 11% or so in the country. But as I'm sure most of you know, the vast bulk of that is plantation forest with introduced non-native conifers from abroad, mostly from North America. And only less than 2% of the forest cover is considered to be native, although I suspect quite a lot of that is mixed with not a few non-native species mixed in, species like beech and sycamore mixed in among that, but predominantly native, I suppose you could say. So just a few examples of where those remaining native woodlands survive. Probably the best known and largest fragments are in Killarney National Park, around the lakes. This view from Ladies View, I think it's called. And that area has been subject to some devastating fires in recent years. The latest being, I think the last bad one was in March 21, when a lot of the park was burnt. So, they're not saved, even though they're in national parks. And probably of most concern is the yew wood, which is unique in Ireland. I think that yew wood that grows on the shores of Lough Lean on limestone rocks and is a large surviving fragment of yew wood one of the largest in the country. So hopefully that they can protect that from fire. There are many other issues there as well, but I won't go into those now. In the west, then you have other really nice pieces of old woodland, tiny fragments though. This one around Garyland, Cool, around the Turlocks there on limestone is one of the best in Clare, Galway. An unusual ash wood, predominantly ash and hazel, growing on the edge of the burn at Slieve Carron. And the unique area at Rock Forest in the burn, tiny little fragment of woodland dominated by Scots pine. And this in recent years has become the site for a confirmation that Scots pine was here present at this site growing for the last at least 10,000 years since the end of the Ice Age, because the pollen record in the lake beside it is a continuous one with pollen of Scots pine right through the sequence. So that's really exciting. And I know that seed from those pines is being grown on in nursery and distributed around the burn and into other places as well. I'm delighted to say we have one in our land here, one little burn pine. Bit closer to home here in Wicklow, we've got a few nice pieces of old native woodland. Glendalough, possibly the best known one, around the Vale of Clara, in Tomnafinogue Wood, right at the very south of the county, around Tinnahealy, Shillelagh. There is the last remaining fragment of a large area of woods, Shillelagh Woods, which once stretched for, I think, about 1/5 of the county, but is now reduced to one little patch that was saved at the last minute. And as you drive down to Wicklow through on the N11, you pass through the Glen of the Downs, which is a very steep glacial valley, and that has some nice oak wood in it as well. So there are a few good areas where you can really see what a woodland should look like, but unfortunately they're very small, and many of them have serious threats to their future. So just in summary then, the best available information on native woodland cover comes from the National Forest Inventory, which is repeated every decade or so. And I've looked at these inventories, these successive inventories, and the best one really is from 20 years ago, nearly 20 years ago, actually, when it was found that about the native woodland covered about 1.9% of the country. So a tiny, tiny portion of what we would have originally had, maybe 80% of the country. And that was the basis on which sites were selected for survey during the National Survey of Native Woodlands. Again, a very thorough exercise done, commissioned by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. By the way, that's my dog drinking, if you can hear the sound rather than my family. So I think she's stopped now. So 1,300 or so native woods were surveyed in that period, that 5-year period. But as you can see from the percentages there, only a tiny proportion of those were over 50 hectares, 3.3% of them. The bulk of them were under 10 hectares, which is 25 acres. Something like only 8.5% were over 10 hectares. So hugely fragmented remains, little patches here, there, and everywhere. More encouragingly, nearly half of them, 44%, are within protected areas, within national parks, within SACs or SPAs or other protected areas, often protected for other reasons, for birds or for plants, but not because they're native woodland. But that doesn't mean they're protected. They're safe, because if you look at the potential damage, nearly a third of them are subject to heavy grazing, heavy browsing, maybe by deer, by livestock, and other animals. We don't know in some cases which animals, but sufficient that there's a threat to regeneration, that young trees may not survive that intensive grazing. And rhododendron, of course, another introduced species, invasive species, are one of the big problems. So it's just a very quick overview of the importance of native woodlands, biodiversity being the one that's closest to our hearts, I think. And it's really staggering when you look at the proportions of plants, breeding birds, invertebrates, fungi, and so on, that are known from woodlands. They represent a really large slice of our native biodiversity. Not surprising when you consider that 80% of the country was covered by this habitat. And again, it doesn't seem surprising now that we had 7 species of bats recorded close to our woodland, when it's one of the most important features of the landscape for them. We all know that woodland has huge benefits for carbon capture and combating climate change, but people sometimes forget that it's the woodland soil which is the most important feature. Only about 20% of the carbon is captured within the wood of the trees itself. So what's most important is that when trees are cut, that the soil is not disturbed and the roots are left intact, and the tree is allowed to grow back on the same site. So the type of management which is known as continuous cover forestry is now seen as the best way to ensure that this carbon is kept in the forest soils, and that there's remains tree cover over the site indefinitely. Water benefits hugely from riverside woodland, lakeshore, I guess you could say as well, particularly where there's intensive farmland like this, because fertilizer, slurry, pesticides all run off the fields and find their way to the nearest watercourse. And the roots of trees and other natural vegetation along the banks will trap and hold these pollutants, at least to slow down their release into the river. And there's plenty of good scientific data that supports that, showing that riparian riverside woodland will improve the quality of the water and improve it for fisheries and for other species. There are, on riverbanks as well, there are great benefits to having trees there, because they bind the soil, prevent or reduce the amount of erosion from fast flowing rivers, and the erosion of the soil will cause silt in the rivers, which then masks gravels and spawning areas for fish. So having the trees along the river binds the soil and holds it together, and has many other benefits as well. Of course, things like otters will breed in under the roots of trees. Timber building should be a much bigger component of our building program. But of course, we've had so little native timber to use that most of it is imported for timber framing. And amazingly, for the furniture industry, about 95% of the hardwood used here is imported, even though we could be growing a lot of this in our as a native resource. Some of the older and more traditional uses of woodland still do survive, but they're quite small scale and scattered. Coppicing, for instance, is used to harvest continually a crop from woodland without destroying the woodland itself, constantly renewing the trees so that they grow back from the roots. And we've had some of our own woodland coppiced, and some of the products from that are shown in the pictures below there, which are really attractive and useful products. And then our own woodshed here shows you that we managed to have a renewable resource coming from our woodland as well. Timber as a fuel is one of the best, if it provided that the wood is dry and the moisture is reduced down to 10 or 20%, less than 20%. It's certainly very highly valuable fuel that can be grown again and replaced. So it's something to be encouraged. And many other uses of native woodland, of course, some of which I wasn't even aware of when I started researching the book. Forest schools are now quite widespread across the country. Children gain hugely from wild play and structured play within a forest setting, where they can get up to all kinds of adventures. And even adults are using woodlands for mental relaxation in a structured way as well through the forest bathing movement. And everybody's heard of foraging, of course, which has grown in importance in this country exponentially, I would say. So a few of the threats, well, I've mentioned the invasive species, rhododendron and laurel being the two kind of dominant ones. Laurel, particularly in Wicklow woodlands, actually is quite a big problem. Rhododendron in the west of the country, in the more acidy, peaty soils. And it's the problem is that it shades the ground heavily, prevents regeneration of other trees and shrubs, and eventually comes to dominate the woodland and impoverishes it and reduces its biodiversity value. The introduced invasive grey squirrel has a different impact in that they tend to strip the bark off the higher parts of trees and can damage the trees, but they don't alter the woodland in any dramatic way, but they can cause damage to trees and premature death. But deer grazing is a significant feature, particularly in Wicklow, very high deer populations here. And so in our own land here, we've had to fence areas of a new woodland, as you can see in the bottom left picture there with the Zika deer, outside the fence, I'm glad to say, in the meadow, but not in the woodland. So woodlands, while we have some nice bits left and very small and fragmented, they do need management because many of them have been neglected, bits that have just been left on the corners of farms or on the sides of hills, which can't be cultivated. And really, we need to look at the conservation necessary for each patch individually. So for this area, we've removed some non-native species, the sycamore, for example. There were a few mature sycamores which have now gone. We've controlled deer grazing, and we've thinned certain areas to allow more light in because there was a dense canopy with little or no regeneration in some parts of it. So we've opened it up and allowed light to come in, and we're delighted now to see new hazel trees and in some cases alder and oak coming up in the clearings. And then in some areas as well, we've planted new woodlands, either extended the old woodland, protecting the trees from livestock and from deer, using either fencing or the tree guards. And we've planted native trees in some of these areas. And this, I just put up here, some people ask me, you know, is there a scheme to support this? Well, there is. It's called the Native Woodland Scheme. And just this beginning of this year, a new program is proposed, which will increase the initial grants, fairly healthy grants, if the land can be dedicated to woodland for decades, and there are, you know, conditions attached and so on, but there's a premium paid each year then per hectare of woodland established, once the woodland is established, to offset any loss of income or any costs that might be entailed with repairing fencing and so on. And there are various different parts of this scheme now, some of which are not clearly defined yet. But I have to say that unfortunate news is that this program is still awaiting approval from the EU Commission. It should have been sent, of course, a long time ago, but wasn't until the end of last year. And for the moment, they're not accepting new applications. They're just giving grants for already approved projects, which were approved by the end of last year. It's an interim scheme using the previous categories, but with new premium rates. So it's all a bit stop-start. At the moment, there's a backlog building up of applications, and that's not in anybody's interest, really, because we need to encourage farmers and landowners to get involved. But the other way, of course, is natural regeneration, and this is something that's been, I think, not given enough attention. If you fence off an area from grazing, you'll get trees seeding themselves naturally from the surrounding seed sources, and in this case, oak, being dropped by acorns, being dropped by birds or by squirrels, and just growing naturally. And probably the best way, because nature knows what grows best, and they'll eventually form woodland. But we decided to speed it up. We're too impatient, and so we fenced off with deer fencing 6 acres, and with a team of volunteers 5 years ago, we planted about 7,500 trees in some of the pasture land. And you can see top and bottom there, before and after, what it looks like now. It's well established, but still you'd hardly call it, woodland. Wait another 5 or 10 years before there'll be a canopy formed, but very encouraging. So just a few quick summary points at the end. I can't give you each copy of the book because I'm not there to give you one, but you can still buy Wildwoods in the bookshops or order it online. I've tried to outline how important the woodlands are in Ireland's history and culture and landscape, and the many benefits that they provide, probably most importantly for carbon capture in the decades ahead. We urgently need to restore existing native woodlands. That's to manage them, to improve them, and to restock them. And we should be establishing new woodlands to take the place of those that have disappeared, in order to support biodiversity in the future. So with that, I'll hand back to Porrick, and hopefully people followed a bit of that.
Thank you so much, Richard. Fascinating stuff, and wonderful to see the beautiful photographs as well. So everyone at home, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A button. The chat, of course, was disabled all along anyway, so you didn't have an option to do that. But if you want to put your question in there, I will get some questions to Richard. Richard, before I go to questions from our audience, I remember visiting your woodland a couple of years ago. You had applied for the Native Woodland Scheme as it was back then. It wasn't a particularly successful scheme as far as I recall it. We haven't been very good at establishing new forests, put it that way, of any kind in recent years. Would you have thoughts on how we can rapidly scale up our approach towards afforestation? Let's not be pejorative about it. It's not necessarily commercial or native woodlands. How can we do this at scale in the time that we need to do it to meet our climate and biodiversity targets, do you think?
Well, like a lot of things, comes back to money. And if you're a farmer landowner who's getting single farm payments through the EU, and the check comes in the post every month for keeping your land in farming, whether it be sheep or cattle or cereals or whatever it is, you'd have to have a very persuasive case to forego that and to hand your land over to planting with trees, which you may not see any return from, for 30, 40 years in terms of, a crop. So, farmers have to think about their income. So, that the grants and premiums have to be as attractive or more attractive than the alternative before I think there'll be wholesale change in terms of private land. In terms of public land, there's a much greater potential because I see no reason why there shouldn't be extensive native woodland schemes on national parks, for example. Much of our national park is in upland areas that are completely devoid of trees, mostly due to sheep grazing, long-term grazing lettings, and extensive deer populations, which are just basically eating everything that appears above ground level. And they need to think seriously about putting resources into deer fencing, deer control, tree planting, and encouraging natural regeneration in areas where it's suitable, for example, in some of the river valleys. So there's just a few thoughts.
Do you see any maybe cultural shift among your neighbors or in your part of the country? Are people thinking about different ways of planting trees? Do you think it's getting more popular, less popular? Do you think the appetite is there? Because presumably if you're planting trees, you're taking land out of agriculture.
Yeah.
It is a change of land use and maybe a change of approach to land.
If there is a change, it's small scale. And it tends to be people who are not full-time farmers. So people who have bought a bit of land for recreational use or for, I don't know, just for the love of the place. And they will look for grants or to help them. And we have small groups of networks of people who help each other. There are volunteer groups now springing up around the country who will help with tree planting, such as Rewilding Wicklow, local group that mobilizes volunteers, and that's fantastic. But I don't see much movement in the public sector, and that's really the area that needs to be focused on. One encouraging, I know that Coillte do get a lot of bad press, particularly at the moment, as you'll be aware. But they did set up a non-profit entity called Coillte Nature a few years ago, which has been doing some good things on their existing estate on land that they already own. It might come as a surprise to know that about 1/5 of the Coillte estate is actually of quite high biodiversity value. Some of it planted, some of it unplanted, some of it native woodland actually. And they are taking over bits of those and managing them better so that they will, improve. They're bringing in continuous cover forestry in some areas, still small scale. And they're experimenting with woodland regeneration on some of the cutaway bogs as well in cooperation with Bord na Móna. So, I mean, I see that as an encouraging sign, but all these things need to be scaled up to landscape scale.
Yeah, very much so. I have a question here about the potential for native woodland in the west of Ireland, Galway, Mayo. Can native woodland grow on bog?
Yes, they can. And all you need to do is look at areas which have been abandoned by turf cutting, where they've not turned into lakes. You will get usually on patches which are drier, where maybe the peat has been completely removed and you have mineral soil at the surface. you'll get extensive growth of willow and birch in particular, those two species which naturally grow in wet and peaty soils. And other things too will come in. I mean, we only need to look at the burren, which is, is all the time trying to cover itself with hazel woodland, which is the natural tree of the bare limestone hills. It's just a matter of really controlling the limiting factors, which are largely grazing and I suppose overproduction, over-exploitation, as in the peatlands.
Have you a view on, many upland areas we see have, maybe a lot of bracken or maybe a lot of gorse, and these areas can then attract fires, or people think they need to be burnt. Have you views on how those kind of areas could be managed? Would they need to go in with tree planting programs, or how would you see that?
Yeah, I think the unfortunate term of scrub has been applied to places covered in gorse and bracken and other shrubby species. And scrub has this sort of almost a bad reputation. It's a bit like describing somebody as a rascal or a vagabond or something. But scrub is essentially the early stages of woodland, and anybody who has watched a field that has been abandoned by agriculture over a period of decades, they'll see scrub spreading in from the margins, followed by tree species establishing in the scrub. And scrub can include brambles, for instance, brambles, gorse, hawthorn. We have patches of blackthorn spreading in our fields. And those are like natural deer fences and exclude livestock and deer, keep them away from the young trees. And you'll find, young ash and oak and many other tree species growing in the center of scrub, coming up, poking up through them. So I believe that on the hillsides, if scrub can be left and not burnt, and grazing reduced, grazing pressures reduced, then we could well see natural regeneration of woodlands quite extensively. Perhaps the answer is realistically, under the present populations of deer, the present pressure of deer grazing is to fence off some of these areas of scrub and just leave them be, and let's see what happens.
Very good. And maybe that leads to one of the questions I have here. There's a few like it. If somebody has a bit of land and they're thinking about, developing it into native woodland, what advice would you give them? Where should they start?
Well, first of all, if they're going to apply for grant support, they'll need to have a registered forester do the application for them. And for tree planting, there are certain mixes of species that are preferred and are considered basically suitable for the types of soils. And a forester will advise on that. So any private forestry company, and there are many, you could call them consultants, who will come in, inspect the land, advise, the type of trees to plant, type of fencing that's needed, what kind of method should be used, whether it's on mounds or whether they're slit trench or how they're planted. And they will apply for the grant and handle that side of it for the applicant, and take it from there. That's how it works usually.
Very good. And how did you find the application process? Was it an easy thing? Did it take a long time?
Relatively straightforward, but that was 6-7 years ago, and it's got more rigorous since. Not unwelcome actually, because the whole process was a bit loose and needed tightening up, but that has brought in more requirements, for example, for detailed ecological surveys. Now, thankfully, the Department of Agriculture will pay for those ecological surveys, and the landowner doesn't have to shell out in advance, because, of course, their application may not succeed if the area is highly sensitive already. And if it, say, for example, it's close to a river, which is a protected habitat, then their grant may not be approved.
There's certainly a lot of money going into afforestation in the coming years. So we do hope that the strategy and the bureaucracy behind it will be sorted out so we can get on with things. Sean is asking here, do we have a scarcity of native tree nursery stock? Are trees very important in relation to the water cycle? There are two separate questions from Sean.
Yeah, well, the first one, and the nursery stock, is a very important question, actually, because I do know that there are relatively few nurseries in the country that are supplying native tree stock from, recorded and registered sources, their provenance being Ireland, preferably from local sources, if possible, from the same region. So, if you're planting in the west of Ireland, ideally the source of seed should come from the west of Ireland as well. But there's such inconsistency, unfortunately, both in terms of supply of seed. For example, oak only produces an acorn crop every 4 or 5 years, maybe less, sufficient to collect large amounts of seed and grow the trees from seedlings. And of course, that means that in some years there's a very short supply of native stock, and some of the schemes have to use imported stock from the nearest possible source, like Britain or Northern Europe. But the other big inconsistency is in terms of demand. So with this sort of stop-start approach in the grant schemes, we're having, feast followed by famine. So one year there may be a huge demand for oak trees or birch trees or Scots pine or whatever it is. The next year there's none, because applications have been stalled, and they're waiting for some new scheme to come in, or for the Commission to give its approval for the next round of grants. So yeah, there is definitely a problem with nursery stock. The nurseries are doing the best, but they are limited by this stop-start inconsistent supply and demand. What was the other question?
You talked about the water cycle. How important are trees in the water cycle?
That's a fairly technical question, I think, but I mean, yes, they are obviously trapping moisture from the air and holding it in their tissues, and then releasing it into the soil, holding it in the soil. Preventing runoff, I suppose, is an important feature. The water cycle is a much bigger thing than that. It involves, the whole cycle from rainfall through rivers and lakes and into the sea and back into the sky again. But yes, I mean, trees being three-dimensional, woodland being three-dimensional, both area and height, have a huge volume of surface area for absorption and holding of water.
Very good. I know it's getting a little bit late, Richard, but with your permission, I have two more questions. Maybe there are a lot of questions. We're not going to get through all of them, but I have two maybe that we could finish up on. One is from Adrian, and he's talking about temperate rainforest zone. Now we know well, we're calling it temperate rainforest now, but it's a very popular term for the kind of forests that we see in Killarney and around the west of Ireland. And we also see maps from Wales and England, but do we know, does that kind of forest apply to the east of Ireland, or what do you think?
I don't think so. Not with the dry weather that we've been having in recent years. We haven't had any rain in this part of Wicklow for 6 weeks or something of that order. We've, in the last 5 years, I think we've had 2 very dry springs and summers. So the frequency is increasing. I don't think we could call that rainforest really. But definitely the West Coast, where rainfall is double or greater annual rainfall, there are areas. And one of the features that really marks this out is that many of the trees are covered in epiphytes. They have a kind of, they're almost wet, permanently wet on their bark and in the crevices, and this provides rooting for ferns and mosses and lichens and all sorts of hanging gardens, we like to call them. So if you see that, it's a sure sign that you're in a kind of a rainforest area. It's a popular term because it helps remind us that, at one stage we had forests of the scale of the Amazon, let's say, or the islands of the Far East, but it's mostly gone, and we're dealing with tiny fragments.
Just as a point of clarification, maybe Catherine is asking about, about your response about woods on bogs. There are maybe blanket bogs or deep peat that we wouldn't expect trees on. Richard, is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
But as we know, large areas of those have gone already. There are very few raised bogs where you could say there's deep peat left. Or where it's intact enough to be living, growing peat. In the west of Ireland, is a bit more blanket bog surviving. However, grazing is a huge pressure there, and then invasive species like rhododendron too. So the chances of survival of trees in those areas is very limited.
Interestingly, you mentioned the National Forest Inventory, which was published a couple of weeks ago, the latest version, and a third of the increase in tree cover, let's call it that, over the last, I think it was 15-year period, was from natural regeneration on cut over bogs, presumably a lot of birch and maybe some trees as well in those areas.
Yeah, I had a read of that report, which is available online. And if you delve down into it, it's actually quite difficult to separate out what is native and what isn't, because they talk about they don't talk about cover of the country. They're talking about the proportion of the woodland resource or the forest resource. And it shows something like 20% mixed and broadleaf. So, it's the definitions are a bit woolly, and I wouldn't be relying on those statistics. What we need is a repeat of the National Survey of Native Woodlands to really give us some hard facts.
Yes, indeed. There's a couple of initiatives like the European nature restoration law that are coming towards us, that are providing more and more incentive for us to get on and do these kinds of things. I'll give you one more question, Richard,
Sure.
just to finish the evening off, and it's from Noel.
You can see the clock behind me here.
Yes, yeah. And she says, excellent presentation. Thank you, Richard. What would be your one big wish to encourage landowners to plant or encourage regeneration of native trees on their land rather than monoculture plantations? She's maybe answering some of your question there, but what would be your one big wish maybe in the coming years as we see changes to our land use happen?
I think if we could see organizations like the Department of Agriculture and the IFA and other representative bodies really taking it on board and promoting it among their grant grantees and members with a seriousness in the same way that they promote dairy and beef and cereal. I think we'd be onto a winner then. But unfortunately, until then, it's going to be a kind of an uphill battle. And it'll be down to organizations like the Irish Wildlife Trust and others to keep the flag flying, you know. So keep up the good work, Cork.
Well, thanks for that, Richard. We do our best. And there's lots of people out there, I think, who really want to see change coming, and it's actually been very heartening to see the connection that people feel towards our native woodlands, and I think that's reflected tonight in the number of people who've turned up for your talk. So thanks again, Richard. It's really been a very illuminating talk. And once again, your book is called Wild Woods as part of the series of books that you have written of late. And thank you everybody at home for tuning in. Many of you were asking whether the talk has been recorded, and it is, and it will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So please do check that out, and also check out the number of talks that we've had over the last couple of years on a range of subjects, including other talks from other speakers about native woodlands and natural regeneration, rewilding, and all kinds of things. And also please do consider joining the Irish Wildlife Trust so we can continue to keep these talks going and keep them free and as accessible as possible. So thank you once again to Richard. Good night, and I will see you all hopefully next month, where we have a very exciting webinar lined up for you in April. Good night, everybody.